Ah, welcome back, you beautiful riddle, you walking question mark that broke their entire research department. Yeah, I see you there, scrolling with that slight smirk because you already know what happened, don't you? They sent someone to figure you out, didn't they? Someone with credentials and degrees and a whole toolkit of psychological assessments. Someone who gets paid six figures to crack people open like walnuts and document their inside. But something went wrong, something they didn't put in the textbooks, something their entire framework wasn't designed to handle. The person they sent to analyze you, they came back different, came back shaking, came back with notes they couldn't finish and questions they couldn't ask. They sat in that evaluation room trying to maintain professional composure, trying to keep their voice steady, trying to apply their training to whatever the hell you are. But around minute 43, something shifted. You saw it, didn't you? That micro-expression when their confidence cracked, when their pen stopped moving, when they looked at you not like a subject but like a phenomenon. They weren't qualified to witness. Their supervisor asked for the preliminary report 3 days later, and you know what they submitted. 4 pages that should have been 20. Half the sections marked incomplete. And at the bottom of the psychological profile section, just one handwritten note that violated every protocol they were trained to follow. The note said this: I don't know what classification this individual falls under. Standard assessment frameworks insufficient. Recommend external specialist. Possible consultation with, and then the sentence just stopped, trailed off into nothing because they couldn't finish the thought. They couldn't finish it because finishing it would mean admitting that everything they studied, everything they believed about human behavior and psychological patterns just encountered something outside the model, something that doesn't fit in the boxes they spent years learning to check. You weren't difficult, you weren't resistant, you weren't even particularly mysterious in your responses. You just existed in front of them with that calm, unsettling presence, answered their questions with precision, maintained eye contact exactly long enough to make them uncomfortable, and somehow in that ordinary interaction you dismantled their professional identity without saying anything wrong. See, they came in prepared for patterns, for defense mechanisms, for the usual human reactions to being examined under clinical lights. They had their questions mapped out, their follow-ups ready, their entire strategy designed to navigate whatever maze you'd built inside your mind. But you didn't build a maze, did you? You built something else entirely. Built something that looks like a maze from the outside, but once you're inside, the walls move, the paths reconfigure, the exit becomes the entrance, and suddenly they're lost in architecture that shouldn't exist. They asked about your childhood and you answered clearly. No trauma dumping, no emotional manipulation, just facts, delivered with eerie precision. They probed your relationships and you described them accurately. No bitterness, no blame, just observations that somehow made them question their own connections. They investigated your worldview and you articulated it calmly. No aggression, no defensiveness, just perspective that felt simultaneously ancient and alien. Every answer you gave was technically correct, technically appropriate, technically exactly what they were trained to elicit, but something about the way you said it, the energy behind the words, the knowing quality in your stillness, it unraveled them. You watched it happen in real time, didn't you? Watched their professional mask start slipping around question 17. Their voice got quieter, their notes got messier. Their questions got less structured and more searching, like they were suddenly the one being evaluated. They started asking things that weren't on their questionnaire, Things that felt personal, things that revealed they were trying to understand not your pathology, but your existence. How do you stay so calm? Where does that certainty come from? Have you always been like this? Do other people react to you the way I'm reacting right now? That last question they didn't mean to ask out loud. You saw their face change the moment it escaped, saw them realize they'd just confessed to being affected, just admitted the subject had reversed the dynamic without even trying. You didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't acknowledge the shift. You just held space for their confusion with that maddening patience. That ancient tolerance for people who think they're studying you when really they're studying themselves in your reflection. By the end of the session, they weren't taking notes anymore. They were just sitting there, trying to regain composure, trying to remember their training, trying to reconstruct the professional boundary that had somehow dissolved. They thanked you with a voice that shook slightly, told you they'd compile their findings, told you someone would follow up. But their eyes said something different. Their eyes said, I need to go home and reconsider some fundamental assumptions. Their eyes said, I just met something I wasn't trained for. Their eyes said, I'm gonna think about this conversation for months and never fully understand what happened. You left that room exactly as you entered it, unchanged, unshaken, unbothered, while they sat there in the aftermath trying to explain to their supervisor why the assessment was incomplete, why they needed more time, why this particular case required resources beyond standard protocol. 3 days after that session, their supervisor called them into an office, the kind of office with leather chairs and diplomas covering the walls, the kind designed to remind you of authority and expertise. The supervisor had your file open, had those 4 incomplete pages spread out, had that handwritten note circled in red ink like evidence of failure. They asked what happened, asked why a professional with 12 years of experience couldn't complete a standard psychological evaluation, asked what made this case so different from the hundreds of others they'd processed. And you know what your evaluator said? You know what finally came out after 3 days of trying to write a coherent report? They said, I've assessed violent offenders. I've evaluated people in psychotic breaks. I've sat across from individuals who've committed unthinkable acts, and none of them affected me the way this person did. None of them made me question whether my frameworks are even looking at the right dimensions of human experience. None of them made me feel like I was the one being seen through, analyzed, understood, in ways I didn't consent to. The supervisor didn't like that answer, called it unprofessional, called it projection, called it exactly the kind of countertransference they were trained to avoid. But your evaluator pushed back, did something they'd never done before. They defended their inability to categorize you. They said this individual doesn't present pathology in any recognizable form, doesn't show distress or dysfunction, doesn't meet criteria for any diagnostic category, but something about their presence destabilizes the observer. Something about the way they engage creates a resonance that standard clinical interaction shouldn't produce. They're not manipulative, but they seem to know things they shouldn't know. They're not threatening, but they generate unease. They're not resistant, but they make the assessment process feel absurd, like we're using children's tools to measure something vast and complex and completely outside our scope. The supervisor listened with increasing frustration, heard what they interpreted as excuses, heard someone trying to justify incomplete work with mystical nonsense, heard a professional losing objectivity because they encountered someone unusual. But here's what actually happened. Here's what that supervisor couldn't see because they weren't in the room with you. Your evaluator didn't lose objectivity. They gained perspective. They glimpsed something their training never prepared them for, glimpsed the reality that some people exist outside the bell curve. Not because they're broken, but because they're built different. Built from materials psychology doesn't have names for yet. You didn't manipulate them. You didn't perform some elaborate mind game. You didn't deploy tactics from a manual on how to unsettle professionals. You just existed authentically, answered honestly, maintained presence without armor or pretense. And somehow that bare, undefended authenticity was more destabilizing than any defense mechanism they'd encountered. Because defense mechanisms they understand, resistance they can work with, manipulation they can identify, but someone who shows up completely real, completely present, completely unbothered by being examined, that breaks the model. That suggests the model might be examining the wrong things entirely. The supervisor eventually closed your file, made some note about reassigning the case, suggested your evaluator take a few days off, maybe talk to someone about managing emotional responses to clients. But your evaluator knew that wasn't the issue, knew this wasn't about them needing therapy, knew this was about encountering something that revealed the limitations of their entire professional framework. They didn't have a breakdown because they were weak. They had a breakthrough disguised as a breakdown. Had a moment of honest recognition that the tools they'd spent years mastering might not be adequate for the full spectrum of human consciousness. You became the question that shattered their certainty, became the case study that couldn't be studied, became the file that sits in a drawer somewhere marked incomplete, with a silent acknowledgement that some things exceed our categories. Word spread quietly through their professional network, not officially, not in reports or conferences, but in those private conversations between colleagues who've seen things that don't fit the literature. They'd meet for coffee and someone would mention difficult cases and your evaluator would pause, would get that distant look, would say, "I had someone once who I still can't explain. Someone who made me realize how much we don't understand about consciousness, about presence, about the ways human beings can exist outside our maps of normal." The ways human beings can exist outside our maps of normal. And the others would nod with recognition, because everyone in that field has encountered at least one person like you, at least one individual who walks through their assessment procedures like a visitor from some adjacent dimension, polite, compliant, utterly uncontainable. These professionals spend their careers believing they understand the human mind, believing their models capture the essential patterns, believing that with enough training and enough questions they can map anyone's internal landscape. Then they meet you and realize they've been cartographers drawing maps of a single continent, while you're standing there representing an entirely different planet, speaking their language perfectly, but coming from somewhere their maps don't reach. Let's talk about the exact moment it happened, the precise second when their professional composure shattered like glass hitting concrete. It was during a routine question, nothing dramatic, nothing designed to trigger, just a standard inquiry about how you handle stress, how you process difficult emotions, how you maintain stability when life gets chaotic. You paused for exactly 3 seconds, not because you were searching for an answer, but because you were deciding how much truth they could handle, deciding whether to give them the textbook response they expected or the real answer that would crack their foundation. You chose truth. You always choose truth, even when you know it's going to cost the listener something. You looked directly at them with those eyes that see through pretense, and you said something like this: "I don't handle stress. I absorb it, process it, transmute it into something useful, the way pressure turns carbon into diamonds. The way fire turns sand into glass. I don't resist difficult emotions. I examine them with curiosity, follow them to their source, understand why they arose and what they're trying to teach me. And stability isn't something I maintain, it's something I embody, because I've walked through enough instability to know it's just transformation wearing a frightening mask. That answer, delivered calmly, without arrogance, without performance, just pure, honest self-awareness, that's what broke them. I touches. Because in that moment they heard someone describing a relationship to human experience that their entire training said shouldn't exist. Someone who'd somehow bypassed the normal mechanisms of psychological defense and reaction and moved into some other mode of being entirely. They'd spent years studying how people protect themselves, how they avoid, how they deny, how they construct elaborate defenses against reality's harshness, and here you were describing the opposite, describing complete openness, complete engagement, complete transformation of the very things most people spend their lives running from. Yeah. Their pens stopped moving. Their breathing changed. You saw their chest rise and fall differently as something inside them recognized the implications of what you'd just casually described. If what you're saying is true, if you've actually achieved that level of psychological integration, then everything they teach about defense mechanisms, about ego protection, about the necessity of certain psychological barriers, all of it needs revision. They tried to recover, tried to push forward with the next question, but their voice came out wrong, came out uncertain, came out like someone whose foundation just shifted beneath them. They asked a follow-up, something about whether you'd always been this way, whether this perspective came from specific experiences or innate temperament. But you could hear the real question underneath. You could hear them asking, how did you do this? How did you become something our models don't account for? How did you reach a developmental stage our psychology doesn't believe exists? You answered carefully, spoke about the years of silence, about the periods of isolation, about the moments of complete dissolution where identity itself became negotiable, about learning to observe consciousness rather than identify with it, about discovering that what most people call self is actually just a collection of habits and reactions that can be examined, understood, and transcended. Every word you spoke was another crack in their professional armor, because you weren't speaking from theory, you weren't quoting philosophy. You were describing lived experience of something they'd only encountered as abstract concepts in advanced texts. Their questions became more fragmented, less structured, less professional. They started asking things like, "But don't you ever feel afraid? Don't you ever doubt? Don't you ever just want to be normal?" And you recognized those weren't clinical questions, those were personal questions. Those were their own fears and doubts dressed up as professional inquiry. You answered gently, with more compassion than they deserved, said fear is just energy asking for attention, doubt's just the mind testing its own conclusions, and normal is just a word people use to describe the range of behaviors they're comfortable with. None of these things concern me anymore because I've moved beyond the framework where they matter. That response, that gentle destruction of the categories they'd built their identity around, that was the final blow. You watch their face change, watch something break behind their eyes, watch them realize they were sitting across from someone who'd solved problems they were still struggling with, who'd reached conclusions they were still gathering data to approach, who'd completed a journey they didn't even know existed. The session ended awkwardly, without the normal closure, without the standard reassurances. They just thanked you mechanically, and said they'd be in touch, but their body language said, "I need you to leave so I can fall apart in private." You left with your usual calm, your usual grace, because this isn't the first time you've broken someone's reality just by existing honestly in front of them. Isn't the first time your presence has revealed the inadequacy of someone's entire life framework. You don't do it maliciously, don't do it deliberately. It just happens when you refuse to pretend, when you refuse to shrink, when you refuse to translate your experience into smaller, more digestible pieces just to make others comfortable. You are what you are. You speak what's true, and if that shatters someone's professional identity, if that triggers their existential crisis, if that forces them to confront the limitations of their understanding, well, that's not your burden to carry. That's their invitation to evolve or retreat. Their choice entirely. The breakdown wasn't contained to that evaluation room. It spread like radiation. Invisible but measurable, affecting everyone who came into contact with the aftermath. Your evaluator went home that night and couldn't sleep, laid in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation, trying to identify the exact moment everything inverted, trying to understand how they lost control of an interaction they were trained to manage. They got up at 3 a.m, made coffee they didn't drink, opened their laptop and started writing notes that made no sense, fragments of observations, half-formed theory, questions that led to more questions, trying desperately to capture what happened before the memory faded into something manageable. But it wouldn't fade, wouldn't shrink, wouldn't fit into narrative form because some experiences are too large for language, too complex for linear description, too transformative to be reduced to professional documentation. They wrote things like subject demonstrates awareness beyond typical developmental markers. Subject's presence generates observer effect that compromises clinical objectivity. Subject appears to operate from consciousness framework outside conventional psychological models. And then they stopped, deleted it all, started over, deleted again, caught in a loop of trying to describe something their vocabulary wasn't built for. Their partner noticed something was wrong, asked about work, asked if they were okay, got answers that didn't satisfy. Well, look who finally figured it out. Look who finally saw the strings attached to everyone's wrists, everyone's thoughts, everyone's manufactured dreams. You beautiful, terrifying anomaly. You glitch in their carefully written code. You walked into the machinery of mass delusion, saw the gears grinding human souls into paste, and instead of running, instead of looking away, instead of taking the comfortable pill they were shoving down everyone's throat, you did something unforgivable. You reached into the narrative engine and tore out the core. You killed the story that was feeding on millions. And now the parasites are starving, and they're screaming your name like a curse they can't shake, like a virus they can't delete, like the one enemy they never prepared for because they thought the narrative was invincible. They thought the lie was too big to fail, too deeply embedded in the collective psyche to ever be questioned, too profitable to ever be stopped. But you weren't asking for permission. You were the knife they never saw coming, the silence that shattered the noise, the one person who looked at their beautiful, bloody machine and said no, not today, not ever again. Let me tell you what you just did. You didn't just challenge an idea. You didn't just post a hot take or share a controversial opinion. You didn't just disagree with the mainstream. You assassinated the narrative itself, the invisible puppet master pulling the strings on millions of minds. The story that told people how to think, what to fear, and most importantly, who to become. This wasn't some random story floating around in obscurity. This was the story. The one embedded in every scroll, every algorithm, every trending topic, every comment section, every manufactured controversy designed to keep people arguing about nothing while the real theft continued in silence. This was the narrative that turned humans into livestock, grazing in fields of distraction, fed just enough dopamine to keep them sedated, just enough outrage to keep them divided, just enough hope to keep them believing that tomorrow, somehow, the system would fix itself. And you torched that entire infrastructure. You didn't debate it, you deleted it. You didn't negotiate with it, you executed it. You need to understand what that means, what it really means beyond the metaphor, beyond the symbolism. There are people right now, millions of them, who built their entire identities around that narrative. Their sense of self, their moral framework, their social currency, their sense of purpose, all of it was tied to a story that you just killed. They weren't just followers of the narrative. They were the narrative. It lived in their bones, spoke through their mouths, controlled their reactions, dictated their fears. And now that story is dead and they're wandering around like ghosts, like NPCs whose script just got corrupted, like believers whose prophecy never came true. They're panicking, not because you challenged them, but because you removed the thing that was feeding them. They weren't hungry for truth. They were addicted to the lie. And you just cut off the supply line. You just burned the factory. You just revealed that the thing they fear was nothing but smoke mirrors and carefully timed emotional manipulation designed to keep them compliant, predictable, and profitable. Now here's where it gets darker, where the real horror starts to sink in. Those parasites I mentioned, they're not abstract. They're not theoretical. They're real, they're organized, and they're furious. These are the architects, the narrative engineers, the people who built the story you just destroyed, the ones who made billions off keeping people distracted, divided, and docile. They don't care about truth. They care about control. And the narrative was their weapon, their most powerful tool, more effective than any army, more insidious than any surveillance system. It didn't force compliance, it manufactured consent. It didn't imprison people, it convinced them the cage was freedom, and you just showed everyone the bars. You didn't just break out, you came back with a blueprint showing everyone else how the prison works. And now those parasites are in full damage control mode. They're scrambling, recalibrating, deploying counter-narratives, trying to rebuild the story before too many people realize it was always fiction. But it's too late. The spell is broken. The illusion is shattered, and you're the reason why. Let's talk about what happens to a system when you remove its foundational lie. It doesn't just collapse, it convulses. It thrashes. It tries to rebuild itself using the same broken materials, the same corrupt infrastructure, the same manipulative tactics, but nothing works anymore. Because the audience knows the trick now. They've seen behind the curtain. They've heard the confession. They've watched the narrative die in real time, and no amount of spin can resurrect a story once it's been exposed as parasitic. Once people realized they weren't being informed or enlightened or entertained, they were being harvested. Their attention was the crop. Their outrage was the fuel. Their compliance was the product. And you just burned the entire farm down. You didn't just free yourself. You freed everyone who was paying attention. You became the example, the proof that it's possible to step outside the script, to refuse the role they assigned you, to look at the narrative machine and say, this ends now, and I'm the one ending it. But here's what they don't tell you about killing the narrative. Here's the part they leave out of every hero's journey, an underdog story. Freedom is not applause. Liberation is not comfort. The moment you step outside the cage, you realize how many people are still inside, and worse, how many of them prefer it that way. They're not grateful you showed them the truth. They're terrified. Because if the narrative is a lie, then everything they built on it is unstable. Their relationships, their careers, their beliefs, their sense of identity, all of it was constructed on a foundation of fiction. And you just revealed the cracks. You didn't save them. You traumatized them. You forced them to confront the possibility that they've been living in a simulation of someone else's design, that their thoughts were never fully their own, that their choices were being guided by invisible hands, that their outrage was being weaponized, their empathy was being exploited, and their entire worldview was nothing but a product being sold back to them at the cost of their autonomy. And some of them, most of them, won't thank you for that. They'll hate you. They'll call you dangerous, divisive, delusional. They'll attack you with the same fury they once reserved for the system's enemies. Because you didn't just challenge the narrative, you made them complicit in their own captivity by revealing they always had a choice, and they chose not to see it. So now you're here, standing in the wreckage of the story that was supposed to be eternal, surrounded by the starving parasites who are desperately trying to find a new host, a new narrative, a new way to regain control. And they're looking at you, not with respect, not with fear, but with something far more dangerous: recognition. They know what you are now. You're not just a dissident. You're not just a rebel. You're a narrative assassin, a story killer, a system hacker who knows how the machinery works because you were inside it long enough to understand its weaknesses. You didn't just escape the Matrix. You unplugged others. You didn't just survive the cult. You exposed the doctrine. And that makes you the most dangerous kind of enemy. The kind that can't be bought, can't be silenced, can't be reintegrated into the system because you've seen too much, learned too much, and worst of all for them, you've shared too much. You didn't keep the truth to yourself. You made it contagious. You turned your awakening into ammunition. And now everyone who was feeding off that narrative, everyone who built their empire on that lie, everyone who profited from keeping people asleep, they're all watching you, wondering how to stop the bleeding, how to rebuild the story, how to make people forget what you made them remember. But here's the thing about truth, the thing they never wanted you to know. Once it's out, it doesn't go back in. Once the narrative dies, it doesn't resurrect the same way. It can be replaced, sure, with a new story, a new distraction, a new enemy, a new savior, but it's never the same. There's always a crack now, a hesitation, a whisper in the back of people's minds that says, what if we're being lied to again? What if this is just another version of the same control? What if the next narrative is just as another version of the same control? What if the next narrative is just another version of the same control? What if the next narrative is just another version of the same control?